Hundreds of people are waiting to see a doctor in Yemen's Taiz province. This hospital sees at least 20 cases of acute malnutrition daily. The United Nations says Yemen is on the brink of the worst famine the world has seen in decades. It's one of 7 countries the UN has identified as in need of assistance, and the situation is only expected to get worse due to COVID-19.
At the beginning of 2020, we thought that nearly 170 million people in the world would need humanitarian assistance this year. Coming into 2021, we think that's going to be 235 million people. That's a 40% increase. And the increase arises almost entirely because of COVID-19.
The UN estimates 1 in 33 people will need aid in 2021 to meet basic needs like food, water, and sanitation. That's a 40% increase on 2020's figures. The record $35 billion requested by the UN would be enough to help 160 million of the most vulnerable people worldwide.
The picture we are presenting is the bleakest and darkest perspective on humanitarian need in the period ahead that we have ever set out, I think. And that is a reflection of the fact that the COVID pandemic has wreaked carnage across the whole of the most fragile and vulnerable countries on the planet.
War-ravaged Syria and Yemen top the list of the countries most in need of humanitarian assistance. The world body is seeking about $6 billion to help Syrians struggling after a decade of conflict, and $3.5 billion to help the nearly 20 million Yemenis caught up in the world's worst humanitarian crisis. In 2020, countries donated a record $17 billion, but it still falls short of the UN's appeal. So raising $35 billion for 2021 at a time of global economic crisis is an ambitious undertaking. But the UN says, while the figure may seem large, it's actually small in comparison to what wealthy countries are spending to rescue their tanking economies. Natasha Hussain, TRT World.
Now let's get more on this from Yens Larkin in Geneva. He's a spokesperson with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Welcome to the show. Now, the UN is asking for twice as much money, effectively, for next year as it did this year. Tell us, why has the need for aid risen so sharply?
It is true, we are going to try to help more people in more countries. Actually, this appeal that we have put out now for next year covers 56 countries in total. As we heard the Emergency Relief Coordinator Mark Lowcock mention there, it is due to COVID that it's going to get more expensive and that more people are in need. Now, mind you, before COVID even happened, when we started 2020, we already had record needs around the world in a large number of places. The reasons were and still are the effects of climate change and also conflict, which drives these needs and drives up the number of people who need help, the amount of help that they need, and the period of time that they need it.
Now, this appeal comes at a time, of course, when many countries are struggling to keep their economies afloat. Does that impede efforts to raise aid?
I don't think one single country in the world has escaped the effect of COVID-19, either as the direct health impact of it or the secondary effects of it, particularly the economic downturn. That is, of course, hitting everyone, but some are being hit more than others. And some have a little more buffer to give off than others. Others, as we saw there, some countries, we see famines looming on the horizon, and that's very worrying. We also say that, well, when we are asking the donors to come out and help us with these huge amounts of money. Well, when you look at it, those amounts are not that big when you compare to what they have spent on this on themselves, and rightly so. They, of course, they are responsible for the citizens in their own country, but it amounts to probably 1% of what they have spent on themselves that makes sense to help others with. One of the reasons, and I think very importantly, is that apart from the sheer, if you like, human impulse that there is behind helping the fellow human men and women and children around the world, there's also an element of self-interest, because these crises are hard to contain. A country like Turkey, you know very well the effects over the past decade of what has happened in Syria. So it does make sense for everyone to chip in, because that is the only way we can secure a safe future for everybody.
Now, looking at the statement that came out earlier, we saw that some of the shortfall in funds is because of perhaps lower donations from the Gulf states. Now, some of the most vulnerable countries mentioned here include conflict zones like Yemen. Are you worried that politics might dictate who gets help and who doesn't?
I think it's worth mentioning that even though we very rarely get the full amount of what we are asking for, the donors as a whole, all of them combined collectively, actually gives more and more every single year. And we're going to reach at least 17 billion, perhaps more when we get to the end of this year in donor funding. So that is highly appreciated. The problem is that the needs are simply outrunning these donations. So that creates a gap that is growing. It's also the case that there is a handful of countries that provide the bulk of the donations. There are good reasons for that. These are the very big economies in the world. We have a very long history collaborating with them, and they're very generous. Of course, we appeal to all countries to step forward. That includes the countries in the Gulf, to provide the funding and provide assistance in the same spirit as we have designed our humanitarian plans. So those plans are based on fundamental principles of impartiality, of neutrality. This is about saving the lives and livelihoods and well-being of our fellow human beings. And that is the spirit in which the plans have been devised. And that is how donations are received as well.
Yens Larkin, thank you so much for joining the show, telling us there how really it's imperative that all countries step up to help the most vulnerable. Now,